In the quiet town of Ashton Pines, a retired judge named Edward Langston lives a peaceful life shaped by decades of championing justice and fairness. But when a sudden confrontation between a young black teacher, Michael Harrison, and local police officers threatens the fragile sense of community, Edward is drawn back into a fight he thought he had left behind. At the center of the storm is Officer Ryan Taylor, a man burdened by his past mistakes and rigid beliefs. When assumptions lead to an unjust traffic stop, tensions rise and long-buried wounds resurface. Yet, amidst the pain and mistrust, an extraordinary question emerges. Can broken trust ever be rebuilt? Guided by wisdom, resilience, and a belief in the power of change, Edward steps in, not just as a witness to injustice, but as a bridge between two divided worlds. As the community gathers for difficult conversations, unexpected alliances form, and those once blinded by fear begin to see the humanity in others. But will their efforts be enough to heal the divides and spark lasting change? Or will old habits and pride prove too strong to overcome? The autumn sun rose slowly over the quiet streets of Ashton Pines, casting a soft golden light on the rows of homes nestled behind towering maple trees. Red and orange leaves fluttered in the crisp air, settling on the front lawns of homes where children played, dogs barked, and life moved peacefully. At the end of the lane stood a modest brick house with white shutters. The house belonged to Edward Langston, an 80-year-old retired judge whose reputation had long outlived his career. Edward had lived in Ashton Pines for over 30 years, but no one could forget that he had once been the youngest black judge appointed in Virginia's history, a symbol of resilience and justice for many. Edward sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee resting on the small wooden table beside him. The chair creaked as he leaned back, but he found the sound comforting. Mornings had always been his time to reflect, to listen to the soft hum of life around him. He had earned this quiet life after decades spent in courtrooms defending the rights of others. But as peaceful as the scene was, a shadow lingered in Edward's heart. Retirement had given him time to think, sometimes too much. Though he no longer wore the black robe of a judge, he could not escape the memories of the cases that haunted him. Families torn apart, injustices ignored, and the harsh reality that progress, though real, was painfully slow. Edward sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest as he watched the street come to life. His neighbor, Michael Harrison, a young high school teacher, waved as he pulled out of his driveway in his sleek blue sedan. Edward waved back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Michael had moved in 2 years ago, full of enthusiasm and energy. He often stopped by to chat about his students or ask Edward for advice. "Good morning, Dad," came a familiar voice from behind him. Edward turned to see his daughter, Denise, step out onto the porch. Denise was in her late 40s, a civil rights lawyer who had inherited his sense of justice, but expressed it with a fierceness that sometimes worried him. She was dressed sharply in a navy suit, her thick curls pulled into a bun. "Morning, Denise," Edward said with a warm smile. "How is the fundraiser coming along?" Denise let out a small sigh as she took a seat beside him. "Busy, but it is coming together. The community center is lending us the space, and we have more volunteers than I expected. We just need a few more donors to reach our goal." Edward nodded, pride swelling in his chest. He admired Denise's determination, though he sometimes wished she would slow down. She had carried the torch of justice further than he had ever dreamed, but it came at a cost. Her work often kept her up late and weighed on her heavily. "You are doing important work," Edward said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thanks, Dad." Denise looked at him with a soft smile, but her eyes were tired. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sharp sound of a siren. Both of them turned toward the street as a patrol car came into view, its red and blue lights flashing. The cruiser slowed as it approached Michael's driveway. Edward's heart sank. Michael had just pulled in from a morning errand and was stepping out of his car when 2 officers exited their vehicle. One of them, Officer Ryan Taylor, was a tall, broad-shouldered man known for his strict, no-nonsense approach. The other officer, a younger man named Ethan Burke, looked more hesitant. "Step away from the vehicle," Taylor ordered, his hand resting on his belt. Michael froze, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Suspicion of a stolen vehicle," Taylor said flatly. Edward set his coffee cup down, his pulse quickening. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. Denise shot to her feet. "This is absurd," she whispered. Edward stood and adjusted his coat, his mind racing. He had seen scenes like this too many times in his life, innocent men accused simply because of how they looked. Memories from his youth flashed before his eyes. The patrol cars, the accusations, the humiliation. "Dad, we cannot just watch this happen," Denise said, anger simmering beneath her words. Edward nodded, but he placed a calming hand on her arm. "Wait, we need to approach this carefully." With steady steps, Edward walked toward the officers, his back straight despite the weight of his years. Denise followed close behind, her fists clenched. Neighbors began to gather on their porches, watching the scene unfold. "Good morning, officers," Edward greeted them, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a reason you are questioning my neighbor?" Taylor's eyes flicked toward Edward with annoyance. "And you are?" Edward met his gaze without flinching. "I am Edward Langston, a retired judge. This young man is my neighbor, Michael Harrison. I can personally vouch for him." Michael's eyes widened with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Judge Langston?" Officer Burke's tone softened as he recognized the name. He had read about Edward in law school, a man whose rulings had set precedents for civil rights cases in Virginia. Taylor, however, remained rigid. "We have to follow protocol, Judge, or not." Denise stepped forward, her voice like steel. "Protocol does not mean harassment. You need reasonable cause, and you do not have it." Edward raised a hand, urging calm. "I understand the need for caution," he said, "but we must also exercise reason and respect." He gestured toward the growing crowd. "This is a community, not a battlefield." Taylor's jaw tightened, but Edward noticed the younger officer shift uncomfortably. Burke seemed to recognize that this was a moment that could either restore or erode trust. Michael took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. "I have my registration and ID in the glove compartment. You are welcome to check." Taylor hesitated before glancing toward Burke, who nodded slightly. With a begrudging sigh, Taylor stepped back. "Fine, let us check it." Edward watched the officers move toward the car, but his focus remained on Michael. The young man's shoulders were tense, but there was gratitude in his eyes. Edward gave him a small nod of reassurance. As they waited for the officers to complete their checks, Edward felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had stepped away from the courtroom, but justice had followed him home. The sound of footsteps drew their attention. Captain Robert Monroe, the local precinct commander, was approaching in his unmarked car. Edward's gaze shifted to the captain, knowing that the next few moments would determine much more than the outcome of this incident. The moment Captain Robert Monroe stepped out of his unmarked car, the atmosphere shifted. The murmurs of the gathering neighbors quieted, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Monroe was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a calm but authoritative presence. He was well respected in Ashton Pines for his fairness, though his no-nonsense approach left little room for excuses. "Judge Langston?" Monroe greeted with a respectful nod as he walked up to Edward. His gaze shifted to the officers standing near Michael's car. "What is going on here?" Edward's face was calm, though his heart still raced with unease. "Captain, there seems to be a misunderstanding. These officers have stopped Mr. Harrison under the suspicion that his car is stolen. I can assure you that Michael is the rightful owner." Monroe's eyes darkened as he turned toward Officer Taylor. Did you verify the report before acting? Taylor hesitated. We were about to check his documents. Monroe's gaze sharpened. We're about to? Officer Taylor, you are not new to the force. Proper protocol is not optional, it is mandatory. Taylor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Burke, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Monroe took a step forward and addressed Michael directly. Mr. Harrison, I apologize for the inconvenience. May I see your registration and ID? Michael nodded and reached into the glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed over the documents with a steady hand. Monroe reviewed them carefully before nodding. Everything checks out. He handed the papers back to Michael. You are free to go. Again, I apologize for this disruption. Michael let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Thank you, Captain. Edward felt a wave of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the situation should never have escalated in the first place. Monroe turned to the crowd of neighbors and spoke with a steady voice. There is no threat here. Please return to your homes. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though some lingered, watching with wary eyes. Monroe then faced Taylor and Burke. I need a word with both of you at the station. His tone left no room for debate. Taylor gave a curt nod, while Burke cast a quick glance at Edward, guilt flickering in his eyes. Yes, sir. As the officers returned to their patrol car, Monroe stepped closer to Edward and lowered his voice. I am sorry you had to step in, Judge. This should not have happened. Edward's expression was thoughtful but calm. I appreciate you stepping in, Robert. But we both know this is not just one isolated incident. Trust between law enforcement and the community is fragile. Incidents like this can break it entirely. Monroe nodded, a somber look crossing his face. You are right, and it is my responsibility to make sure this does not happen again. Denise, who had been standing quietly beside her father, finally spoke. Captain, with all due respect, words alone are not enough. Her voice was firm but respectful. This community needs to see accountability and real change. Monroe regarded her for a moment before giving a slow nod. Understood, Ms. Langston. I promise you that we will address this. Denise crossed her arms, still wary, but she seemed slightly reassured. We will be watching. Monroe gave a small nod, then turned and walked back to his car. Edward placed a hand on Denise's shoulder. Let us head back. As they walked back to the porch, Michael approached them, his face still marked with disbelief. Judge Langston, I do not know how to thank you. Edward gave him a warm smile. You do not have to thank me. We look out for each other around here. Michael nodded, his voice quieter now. I am just tired of this. No matter how hard I work, it always feels like I have to prove I belong. Denise's expression softened. You do not need to prove anything. You belong here as much as anyone else. Michael gave a small, grateful smile before glancing toward his house. Thanks again. I should head inside before my mom starts worrying. Edward chuckled. Go on then. And tell your mother I said hello. Michael waved and jogged back toward his front door. Denise and Edward returned to their chairs on the porch. The street had fallen quiet again, but the tension still hung in the air. Denise stared out at the fading sunlight, her expression thoughtful. You did the right thing, Dad, she said after a long silence. Edward sighed and took a sip of his now cold coffee. I just wish we lived in a world where doing the right thing was not always necessary to stop the wrong. Denise looked over at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and sadness. You taught me that doing nothing in the face of injustice is the same as accepting it. Edward's lips curved into a small smile. And you taught me that change requires more than patience. It requires action. Denise gave him a soft smile in return. We make a good team, do we not? Edward chuckled. Yes, we do. They sat in companionable silence as the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, and for a moment the world felt peaceful again. But Edward knew that the peace was fragile. "Tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence. Denise turned to him. "What about tomorrow?" Edward's gaze was steady. "We need to talk to the community. If trust is going to be rebuilt, it has to start with honesty and transparency." Denise nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I will help organize a meeting at the community center. People need to know they have a voice." Edward smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "I knew I raised you right." Denise laughed softly. "You had your moments." As the night settled in, Edward leaned back in his chair, his thoughts already moving ahead to the next step. He had spent his life fighting for justice in the courtroom, but he realized that the real battle had always been in the hearts and minds of people. In that quiet moment, he felt a flicker of hope, not because the work was over, but because the fight was not his alone anymore. The next morning, Ashton Pines was blanketed in a soft mist. The sun's rays cut through the fog, casting long golden streaks over the damp grass and dew-covered mailboxes. Edward Langston sat at his kitchen table, stirring a bowl of oatmeal. His mind, however, was far from the present moment. Denise stood by the stove, making tea. She had arrived early to discuss the community meeting they were planning, but she noticed that Edward had grown unusually quiet. "Dad?" she asked gently, setting the kettle down. "You okay?" Edward blinked as though pulled from a distant memory. He took a deep breath and set his spoon aside. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice low. Denise took a seat across from him, studying his face. She had seen that expression before, the distant gaze, the tightened jaw. "About yesterday?" she asked. Edward nodded but hesitated before speaking. "Not just yesterday, about the past." His eyes softened as he leaned back in his chair. It is strange how one moment can bring everything rushing back. Denise remained silent, knowing he needed space to share in his own time. Edward let out a slow breath. "I was 16. It was a warm spring afternoon. I had just left the library with a book in my hand. I was walking home, my head full of dreams. I wanted to be a lawyer, someone who could change things." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. Then they came. Denise felt a chill as she listened. A patrol car pulled up beside me. 2 officers got out, their expressions cold. One of them asked where I was going. Edward's voice grew quieter, but his words were steady. "I told them I was heading home, but they did not believe me. They said I looked suspicious, asked to see my bag. I was confused, scared." He swallowed hard. "They pushed me against the wall of a store. My book and papers spilled onto the ground, but they didn't care." Denise's heart ached as she pictured her father so young, defenseless, and humiliated. "I kept thinking, what did I do wrong? What made me different from the other boys who walked home without a second glance from the police?" Edward's gaze met Denise's, a sadness lingering in his eyes. "That day, I promised myself that I would never let fear define me. I would never let anyone else make me feel small." Denise reached across the table and took his hand. "You didn't let them break you, Dad." Edward smiled faintly. "No, I didn't. But I have carried that moment with me ever since." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. "Dad," Denise began softly, "you have spent your life helping others stand tall, even when the world tried to knock them down. But I know how exhausting it must be to carry that burden." Edward gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I carry it so you don't have to." Denise's eyes filled with emotion. "But I want to carry it with you. We can face it together." Edward's smile widened, pride shining in his eyes. "You already are." The rest of the morning passed quickly as they finalized the details of the community meeting. By noon, they had confirmed the use of the community center and reached out to local residents to invite them. Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. At 1 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. Denise opened it to find Michael Harrison standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "Hey, Mr. Langston," Michael greeted, adjusting the strap of the messenger bag slung over his shoulder. "I just wanted to check in and say thank you again for yesterday." Edward walked to the door, his face lighting up with warmth. "Michael, come in. No need to stand out there." Michael stepped inside, nodding at Denise before turning to Edward. "I really appreciate what you did. It could have gone a lot worse if you hadn't stepped in." Edward waved a hand dismissively. "You don't owe me any thanks, Michael. I did what anyone should do." Michael shook his head. "But most people wouldn't. You spoke up when you didn't have to. That means a lot." Denise smiled. "We are holding a community meeting tomorrow night to talk about what happened and how we can prevent it from happening again. You should come." Michael's face brightened with interest. "I will be there. And if there's anything else I can do to help, just let me know." Edward clapped him on the shoulder. "Your presence is enough, son, but I appreciate your offer." Michael nodded, his shoulders relaxing. "Thanks. I'll let my mom know about the meeting, too." As Michael left, Edward felt a glimmer of hope. Despite the weight of past injustices, he saw resilience in people like Michael, a new generation determined to make a difference. Later that evening, Edward sat alone on the porch, the stars above twinkling faintly against the dark sky. The street was quiet, the only sound being the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. He closed his eyes and listened to the familiar hum of life around him. He thought of the young boy he once was, the boy who had been pushed against a wall but had chosen to rise. The front door creaked as Denise stepped outside and took a seat beside him. "Long day, huh?" she said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Edward chuckled softly. "The longest." Denise looked out at the stars. "Do you think tomorrow's meeting will make a difference?" Edward's eyes sparkled with quiet conviction. "I believe it will. Change doesn't come all at once, but it starts with people willing to speak up and to listen." Denise nodded, comforted by his certainty. "Then let's make tomorrow count." Edward leaned back, his heart full, despite the challenges that lay ahead. The night was still, but it no longer felt heavy. In its quiet, he found strength. As the stars shone above, Edward felt that despite everything, the fight for justice was worth every step, and that perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow would be brighter. The following evening, the Ashton Pines Community Center bustled with quiet activity. Rows of chairs had been arranged neatly in front of a small stage where a microphone stood at the podium. Neighbors filed in, some greeting each other with nods, others whispering as they settled into their seats. The room buzzed with curiosity and anticipation. Edward Langston stood near the stage, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a nearby window. The hum of conversation filled the room behind him, but he was lost in thought. It had been years since he had spoken to a room like this. He was no longer the judge whose words could silence a courtroom. He was just Edward, a neighbor, a friend, but tonight, that had to be enough. "Looking sharp, Dad," Denise said as she walked up to him, holding a clipboard. She gave him an encouraging smile. "You ready?" Edward turned to her, his eyes twinkling despite his nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be." Denise patted his arm. "You'll be great. You've been preparing for this your whole life." Edward nodded, grateful for her confidence. He stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. The quiet murmur in the room faded as the crowd turned their attention to him. He scanned the room, recognizing familiar faces, his neighbors, his friends, and even a few strangers who had come to listen. At the back of the room, Captain Monroe stood with his arms folded, his expression serious but supportive. Beside him was Officer Burke, who looked nervous but determined. To Edward's surprise, even Officer Taylor was there, standing stiffly near the door, his face unreadable. Edward took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I am not standing here as a retired judge, but as your neighbor, as someone who believes that community means standing together, especially in difficult times. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. 2 days ago, we witnessed something troubling, Edward continued, his voice calm but resonant. An innocent man, Michael Harrison, was stopped by the police because of suspicion that did not align with the reality of who he is. Michael is not just a resident of this community, he is a teacher, a mentor to our children, and a valued neighbor. In the second row, Michael nodded slightly, his face serious. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand. Edward paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Incidents like this are not isolated. Many of us have felt the sting of being judged unfairly. I know that pain personally, but I also know this. Progress cannot be made by pointing fingers alone. We need accountability. Yes, but more than that, we need honest dialogue and a commitment to change. There was a ripple of murmurs through the crowd, some nodding in agreement. Edward's gaze drifted to the back of the room, where the officers stood. Law enforcement holds an important place in our society. We depend on them to protect and serve. But trust must go both ways. We, as a community, need to feel safe, not just from crime, but from judgment rooted in assumption. Captain Monroe stepped forward, his footsteps heavy but steady as he approached the stage. Edward stepped aside, offering him the microphone. Monroe's eyes swept the room before he spoke. Judge Langston is right. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it takes a long time to rebuild. He paused, his voice steady but regretful. I want to begin by apologizing to Michael Harrison and to this entire community. What happened should not have happened, and I take full responsibility as the head of this department. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. Apologies from someone in Monroe's position were rare, but his sincerity was evident. Michael stood up slowly, his face thoughtful. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice clear but cautious. "I appreciate your words, but words alone won't fix what's broken." Monroe nodded. "You're right, which is why we're acting. I have already ordered additional training focused on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. But that's just the beginning. We need more than training, we need transparency. Going forward, I will be working with this community directly to ensure that everyone's voice is heard." Edward watched Monroe closely, looking for signs of empty promises. But Monroe's tone was resolute, his eyes unflinching. He truly wanted to make things right. Denise stepped forward, speaking into the mic. "Thank you, Captain Monroe. Your accountability is a necessary first step. But to move forward, we need real collaboration. We need spaces where officers and residents can build relationships based on trust, not fear." Monroe nodded. "I agree." At the back of the room, Officer Burke raised his hand hesitantly. Edward gestured for him to speak. Burke cleared his throat, his face flushed. I was there during the incident, and I didn't do enough to stop it." His voice trembled slightly, but grew steadier as he continued. "I should have spoken up sooner. I knew it didn't feel right, but I hesitated. I'm sorry." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one spoke, and Burke looked as though he wanted to disappear. But then, Michael spoke again. "It takes courage to admit that." He gave Burke a small nod. "Thank you for being honest." Burke exhaled in relief, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Edward stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Change begins when we're willing to reflect, to admit our mistakes, and to do better. Tonight, I believe we have taken a step in that direction." A wave of applause rippled through the room, hesitant at first, then stronger. Neighbors clapped, some standing as they showed their support. Michael's mother wiped away a tear, pride shining in her eyes. Even Officer Taylor, who had been silent the entire time, seemed affected. Though he didn't move, his gaze softened as he watched the scene unfold. As the meeting drew to a close, people began to approach Edward, Monroe and Michael, shaking their hands and expressing their gratitude. Denise stood beside her father, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Dad." Edward smiled as he looked around the room. "No," he said quietly. "We did it." The weight that had sat heavy on his heart for so long felt lighter. There was still much work to do, but for the first time in a long time, Edward felt hope. As the room emptied out, Monroe approached Edward and offered his hand. "Thank you for leading this, Judge. I meant what I said. This isn't just words. We will make things right." Edward shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." The morning after the community meeting, the air in Ashton Pines felt different, lighter, somehow. The usual hum of life on the quiet street resumed as neighbors greeted each other with smiles and waves. Conversations at mailboxes lingered longer than usual, and the sense of shared purpose sparked by the meeting spread like warmth from house to house. Edward Langston stood on his porch, watching the world stir to life. A cool breeze tugged at the sleeves of his cardigan as he sipped his coffee. Though he felt hopeful after the previous night, he knew better than to believe that one meeting could heal decades of distrust. Change, as always, would take time. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Michael Harrison walking toward him, a small brown paper bag in his hand. "Morning, Mr. Langston," Michael called out as he climbed the steps to the porch. "Morning, Michael." Edward smiled and gestured to the chair beside him. "Come on up and sit a while." Michael sat down and handed Edward the bag. "My mom made cornbread muffins. She insisted I bring you some to say thank you." Edward chuckled as he peeked inside the bag. The sweet, buttery aroma made his stomach rumble. "Tell your mother she has my eternal gratitude." Michael smiled but shifted in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Last night was something else." Edward nodded, setting the bag aside. "It was— You spoke well, Michael. You held your ground." Michael's face brightened slightly, but the worry remained in his eyes. "I keep thinking about Officer Burke and even Taylor. I never thought I would see one of them admit they were wrong. But Burke did. That has to mean something, right?" Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It does. Change does not come from silence. It comes from moments like that, from someone choosing to speak up when it would be easier to stay quiet." Michael let out a slow breath. "I guess. But what about Taylor? He just stood there, stone-faced. I do not think he cares at all." Edward was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. Or maybe he is fighting a battle inside himself that we cannot see." Michael frowned, unconvinced. "Do you really believe that?" Edward nodded slowly. "I have seen it before. Some people hold on to their pride because it is all they have ever known. It takes time for them to understand that letting go of it does not make them weak, it makes them free." Michael looked down at his hands, then back at Edward. "What do we do in the meantime?" Edward gave him a reassuring smile. "We keep moving forward. We keep showing kindness, even when it is hard. And we keep speaking up when it matters." Michael nodded, though his face still held traces of doubt. "I will try." "You will do more than try," Edward said firmly. "You will lead by example. Just you watch." Michael's smile grew, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a little. "Thanks, Mr. Langston. I needed to hear that." Edward patted him on the back. "Anytime, son." Later that afternoon, Edward received a call from Captain Monroe. "Judge Langston," Monroe began, his tone professional but warm, "I wanted to follow up with you personally. I meant what I said last night. Our department is implementing the new training program starting next week. We have already brought in a team of specialists to lead the sessions." Edward leaned against the kitchen counter, listening closely. "That is good to hear, Robert. But training alone will not be enough." "I know," Monroe replied. "That is why I wanted to ask you something. We need more than outside trainers. We need trusted voices from the community. Would you be willing to speak to our officers during the first session?" Edward's brows lifted in surprise. "You want me to speak?" "Yes. Your story carries more weight than any textbook ever could. If anyone can make them see the human side of this issue, it is you." Edward was quiet for a long moment. The idea of standing in front of a room full of officers was daunting. Memories of the fear he had felt as a young man resurfaced, unbidden. But then he thought of Michael, of Burke's quiet apology, and of the neighbors who had stood in solidarity the night before. He straightened his back. "All right," he said. "I will do it." Monroe's voice softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Judge. This means a lot." "Just call me Edward," he said with a chuckle. "I am retired, remember?" Monroe laughed lightly. "Of course, Edward. I will see you at the station next week." The days leading up to the session passed quickly. Denise helped Edward prepare, gathering notes and rehearsing key points. Though Edward was nervous, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. When the day arrived, Edward stood in front of a room full of uniformed officers. The room was silent, their eyes fixed on him. Burke was seated near the front, his expression attentive. Taylor stood in the back, arms crossed, but Edward noticed something different. Taylor's eyes were not cold. They were watchful, as though he was listening, even if he did not want to admit it. Edward began by sharing his story, the memory of being stopped and humiliated as a teenager, the weight of that experience, and how it shaped his path to the courtroom. He spoke not with bitterness, but with conviction and hope. "Justice," Edward said, his voice clear and strong, "is not about power. It is about fairness. It is about seeing people for who they truly are, not who you assume them to be." The room was still, as his words settled in. Even Taylor's rigid posture softened slightly. When the session ended, several officers approached Edward to shake his hand, thanking him for his honesty. Burke was among them, his voice steady but emotional. "Thank you for giving us a chance to do better," he said. Edward clasped his hand firmly. "Do not waste it, Officer Burke." Burke nodded. "I won't." As Edward packed up his notes, he noticed Taylor lingering near the door. For a moment their eyes met. Taylor hesitated, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but real. Edward returned the nod, hope blooming in his chest. Small steps, he reminded himself. Change was slow, but it was happening. As he left the station and stepped into the bright afternoon sun, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but in this moment, he realized something else. Justice was not just about laws and rulings. It was about hearts and minds. He took a slow, steady breath and walked toward his car, ready for whatever came next. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Ashton Pines as Edward Langston returned home from the police station. The conversation with the officers still echoed in his mind, the quiet nods of understanding, the hesitant yet hopeful questions, and the way their eyes softened as he shared his truth. Yet the most surprising moment had been that subtle nod from Officer Taylor. It was small, almost reluctant, but Edward knew how significant it was. As Edward pulled into his driveway, Denise stepped outside to greet him. She had spent the morning preparing for her next case, but had been thinking of her father all day. "How did it go?" Denise asked, shielding her eyes from the sun, as Edward stepped out of the car. Edward closed the car door and smiled, though there was a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. "Better than I expected." Denise folded her arms and followed him up the porch steps. "Really?" Edward nodded as he sat down in his favorite chair. "Yes, they listened." He paused, recalling Taylor's reluctant acknowledgement. Even Taylor was there. He did not say much, but he nodded at the end. Denise raised an eyebrow. "Taylor? The same Officer Taylor who led that traffic stop?" Edward chuckled softly. "The very same." Denise leaned against the porch railing, her expression thoughtful. Maybe you got through to him. Maybe, Edward said quietly, taking a sip of the iced tea Denise had set on the table. But real change takes time. People do not change overnight. Denise sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I know. It is just hard to be patient sometimes. We see so much injustice in the world it feels like we are always running uphill. Edward reached out and placed a hand over hers. I felt the same way when I was your age. But you know what I learned? What? That every step forward, no matter how small, matters. We may not see the finish line, but every inch gained makes the path easier for those who come after us. Denise's face softened as she absorbed his words. I needed that reminder. Edward smiled. We all do. The next morning, Michael Harrison stopped by with a stack of flyers. They were printed on bright white paper with bold black letters, announcing a new community program, Bridges Not Barriers, a dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Denise helped me design these, Michael said, as he handed Edward a flyer. We're hosting a community workshop at the center next week. I thought we could get some volunteers to pass these out. Edward looked over the flyer, pride filling his chest. This is a great idea, Michael. I am impressed. Michael shrugged, but there was a spark of excitement in his eyes. I figured we cannot just wait for things to change. We have to help make it happen. Edward nodded approvingly. You are absolutely right. Denise walked in from the kitchen, drying her hands with a towel. I printed 100 copies. Think that will be enough for now? Michael grinned. I think it is a good start. Denise handed him a stack of flyers. Then let's get moving. The following days were filled with activity. Edward, Denise, and Michael, along with a few neighbors, went door to door handing out flyers and explaining the purpose of the workshop. Most of the residents were supportive, eager to be part of something positive. One afternoon, Edward and Michael knocked on the door of Mrs. Thompson, a widowed grandmother who had lived in Ashton Pines for over 40 years. She opened the door slowly, her face lighting up when she saw Edward. Judge Langston, what a lovely surprise, she said, inviting them in. Edward smiled as he stepped inside. Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I hope you are well. She nodded as she motioned for them to sit. I am as well as anyone my age can be. Now, what brings you by? Michael handed her a flyer. We are organizing a workshop to help build better relationships between the community and the police. We would love for you to come. Mrs. Thompson adjusted her glasses and read the flyer carefully. Well, I think that is a wonderful idea. But you know, her expression grew somber. I have seen so many meetings and promises over the years, and not all of them brought change. Edward leaned forward, his gaze gentle but firm. I understand, Mrs. Thompson. You have every reason to be cautious, but I believe this time can be different. We are not just asking for change, we are working together to make it happen. She looked into his eyes and nodded slowly. If you believe it, then so do I. The day of the workshop arrived, and the community center was packed. Rows of chairs filled the room, and residents of all ages came to listen and share their stories. Captain Monroe stood at the front, alongside Edward and Denise. Burke sat in the audience, listening attentively, while Taylor lingered at the back of the room once again. Michael opened the session with a short introduction, explaining why the workshop was important and how open dialogue could lead to lasting trust. Edward then took the microphone, his voice calm but filled with emotion. We cannot undo the past, he began, but we can choose how we respond to it. We can let our pain harden us, or we can let it strengthen our resolve to be better to do better. The room was quiet, each word sinking in. Residents began sharing their experiences, both positive and painful, and Monroe listened without defensiveness, acknowledging the mistakes that had been made. When it was Taylor's turn to speak, The room grew tense. He hesitated, glancing around at the expectant faces, before finally stepping forward. "I will not pretend I did everything right," Taylor began, his voice rough but sincere. "I made assumptions that day, and I let my own bias get in the way of my duty. I have spent the last few days thinking about that, and I want to do better." The room was silent for a beat before someone began to clap. Soon, others joined in, not because they excused what had happened, but because they saw the courage it took to admit it. Michael exchanged a glance with Edward, who gave him a proud nod. That evening, as the workshop ended, Edward stood by the door, shaking hands and thanking everyone for coming. When Taylor reached him, he paused. "Judge Langston," Taylor said quietly, "I know I have a long way to go, but I meant what I said." Edward looked him in the eye and extended his hand. "Then prove it. Actions speak louder than words." Taylor nodded and shook Edward's hand firmly. "I will." As the last of the residents left the center, Denise turned to Edward, a look of quiet triumph on her face. "I think we did something good today, Dad." Edward smiled, feeling the weight on his heart lift once more. "We did, Denise, and it is only the beginning." Outside, the stars blinked in the clear night sky, and as Edward walked to his car, he felt the hum of change in the air. Slowly, but surely, the ripples of justice were spreading. The next morning, Officer Ryan Taylor sat in his car outside the Ashton Pines precinct, staring at the brick building as if it were foreign to him. The workshop the night before had replayed in his mind all night, keeping him awake long after he had climbed into bed. He had stood in front of neighbors, friends, and strangers, admitting his failure. It was the first time in his career that he had spoken openly about his mistakes, and the weight of their quiet, watchful eyes still clung to him. Yet, despite the knots in his stomach, something else stirred within him relief. He had taken the first step, but the path ahead still felt uncertain. Taylor finally pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The precinct was quiet as he walked inside, greeting the receptionist with a small nod. He barely registered her polite "good morning" as he headed toward the break room, where Officer Ethan Burke was sitting with a cup of coffee in hand. Burke looked up as Taylor entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Hey," Burke said cautiously, "I did not expect you to be in this early." Taylor grabbed a cup and poured himself some coffee, letting the steam rise before he answered. "Could not sleep." He paused before adding, "I keep thinking about what Judge Langston said and what Michael Harrison said, too." Burke leaned forward, setting his cup down. "Me too. That meeting, it was humbling." Taylor took a seat across from Burke, tapping his fingers against the side of his cup. "I have been on the force for 15 years. I thought I was doing everything by the book, but maybe I was not looking hard enough at the book itself." Burke gave a small nod. "Same here. But last night was not about beating ourselves up. It was about learning how to do better. I think we can." Taylor met Burke's gaze, searching for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was sincerity. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Burke said. "And honestly, I think Judge Langston does too. Otherwise, why would he bother speaking to us at all?" Taylor's grip on his cup loosened as Burke's words settled in. "You know what stuck with me most?" Burke continued. "When the judge said that justice is not about power, it is about fairness. It made me realize I became a cop because I wanted to protect people, not control them." Taylor nodded slowly, a memory surfacing. "My dad used to tell me the same thing." His voice softened as he continued. "He was a sheriff in a small town. Everyone knew him, trusted him. He was tough, but fair. When I joined the force, I thought I would be like him." Burke's eyes softened. "What changed?" Taylor exhaled slowly. "I do not know. Somewhere along the way, I think I started seeing the worst in people first. I thought that being cautious meant being strong." Burke leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Maybe being strong is admitting when we got it wrong. Taylor fell silent, staring into his coffee. Yeah, maybe. Later that afternoon, Taylor walked out of the precinct and into the autumn sun. Instead of heading home, he turned toward the community center. The streets of Ashton Pines were quiet, leaves swirling gently at the edges of the sidewalk. When he reached the community center, he hesitated at the entrance. Inside, he could hear faint chatter, the sound of volunteers packing up after the previous night's workshop. He almost turned around, unsure of what he was hoping to find. But then he spotted Judge Edward Langston sitting at a table inside, reviewing papers. Taylor took a steadying breath and stepped inside. Edward looked up, surprised but calm. "Officer Taylor," he greeted. "What brings you here?" Taylor took a seat across from Edward, his nerves making his hands restless. "I wanted to talk." He paused, searching for the right words. "I know I apologized last night, but I wanted you to know that I am serious about doing better." Edward set his papers aside and gave Taylor his full attention. "I believe you, but understanding that you want to change is only the beginning. Change requires action." Taylor nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. That is why I am here." He hesitated, then continued. "You said something last night that stuck with me, that justice is not about power. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Edward's gaze softened. "We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is how we find our way back." Taylor's shoulders relaxed as Edward's words settled over him. "Do you think it is possible to rebuild trust after breaking it?" Edward folded his hands, his expression thoughtful. "It is not easy. Trust is not something you ask for. It is something you earn, one small step at a time. But yes, it is possible." Taylor's throat tightened, but he managed to nod. "I want to earn it." Edward's smile was faint but genuine. "Then start by listening. Really listening to the people you serve, to their stories, and to their fears. That is where trust begins." Taylor absorbed the advice quietly before standing. "Thank you, Judge Langston, for not giving up on people like me." Edward rose and extended his hand. "It is not about giving up or holding on. It is about believing that people can change." Taylor shook his hand firmly, gratitude in his eyes. "I will not waste this chance." As Taylor left the community center, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. That evening, as Edward sat on his porch, Denise joined him with a cup of tea. "You are quiet tonight," she remarked, taking a sip. Edward leaned back in his chair, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Taylor stopped by today." Denise's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Really?" Edward nodded. "He wants to change. I think he means it." Denise tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do you think he can?" Edward's gaze remained fixed on the sky. "If he is willing to listen, yes. And if we are willing to guide him, yes." Denise smiled softly. "You really believe in people, don't you?" Edward's eyes twinkled as he glanced at her. "I believe that kindness, when met with humility, can do more than punishments ever could. It can heal." The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. As they sat in silence, Edward felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The battle for justice was far from over, but small victories like this reminded him that even the hardest hearts could be softened. And maybe, just maybe, the ripple of change was beginning to reach further than he had ever imagined. The following week, the Ashton Pines Community Center was packed once again. This time, however, there was a different energy in the air, not one of tension, but of cautious optimism. The meeting had been called to address the next steps in the Bridges Not Barriers initiative. Residents filled the seats, talking in quiet tones, their conversations weaving between hope and skepticism. Edward Langston stood near the front of the room, adjusting his notes. Denise was beside him, flipping through her folder and nodding to familiar faces as they entered. Michael Harrison sat near the front, his notebook ready. Captain Monroe and several officers, including Burke and Taylor, stood by the side of the stage. Taylor's presence had raised a few eyebrows, but Edward knew the real test would be what Taylor chose to do next. Denise leaned toward her father. "It is a full house tonight." Edward smiled softly. "People want to be heard. That is a good sign." Denise glanced toward Taylor, then back at her father. "Think he will speak?" Edward gave a small nod. "If he is ready, he will." The hum of voices quieted as Edward stepped forward to the podium. The microphone let out a soft crackle as he adjusted it. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here," Edward began, his voice calm but resonant. The crowd settled, their eyes fixed on him. "Our last workshop was a reminder of how much work we still need to do to rebuild trust," Edward continued. "But it was also a reminder of something else, that this community is strong. We care about each other. We want what is right." He paused, glancing at the faces before him. "Tonight is about taking the next step." He nodded toward Captain Monroe, who stepped forward to join him. Monroe's expression was serious but sincere as he addressed the crowd. "I know that for some of you, trust in law enforcement has been broken," Monroe began. "I cannot undo the past, but I can promise you this: my department is committed to doing better. We have already begun new training programs, and we are opening new channels of communication between officers and the community." A few people nodded, though others remained wary. Monroe gestured toward Burke and Taylor. "And tonight, 2 of our officers have asked to speak." There was a murmur of surprise. Burke stepped forward first, his face steady but nervous. "I was part of the incident with Michael Harrison," Burke said, his voice clear. "And I want to say again how sorry I am for what happened. I should have done more to stop it. I cannot change what happened, but I can promise to do better. I have already started attending community events, and I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Soft applause rippled through the room. Michael nodded toward Burke, a quiet show of respect. Then Taylor stepped forward. The room grew tense. Even Monroe's steady expression tightened slightly. Taylor took a deep breath before he spoke. "My name is Officer Ryan Taylor," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I was the lead officer during the traffic stop involving Mr. Harrison. I made assumptions that day, assumptions that were wrong." He paused, his gaze moving across the room. "I let my fear and bias get in the way of my duty, and for that, I am truly sorry." The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of papers. Taylor continued, "I know that my apology does not erase what happened, but I do not want to be the kind of person who hides behind excuses. I want to learn and be better for this community and for myself." His eyes flickered toward Edward. "Judge Langston reminded me that justice is not about power, it is about fairness. I forgot that once, but I will not forget it again." There was another beat of silence before someone began clapping. Soon, others joined in, some slowly, others wholeheartedly. Taylor blinked, almost surprised by the support. Edward stepped forward and placed a hand on Taylor's shoulder. "Thank you, Officer Taylor. Admitting our faults is one of the hardest things to do, but it is the first step toward real change." Taylor nodded, a weight visibly lifting from his shoulders as he stepped back. Denise took the microphone next, her voice steady and passionate. "This is what progress looks like: difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and a commitment to do better. But it does not end here. We need more than words. We need action." She glanced toward Monroe. "That means continuing to build programs where residents and officers can learn from each other. It means transparency and accountability." Monroe nodded firmly. "Agreed. We are committed to making that happen." The floor was then opened to the community. Residents raised their hands, sharing their concerns, hopes, and frustrations. An older man spoke about being stopped unjustly in his youth, his voice trembling with emotion. A young mother shared her fears for her son, who loved playing outside but had already been warned to be careful around police. Edward listened to every story, his heart heavy but hopeful. The room was filled with pain, but it was also filled with resilience. Michael stood last, his voice calm but resolute. "I did not ask to be put in that situation, but I am grateful for what has come from it. I want to live in a community where we trust the people sworn to protect us, and I want them to trust us too." Soft murmurs of agreement echoed through the room. As the meeting ended, Edward stepped back to the microphone. "Tonight, we took another step forward. We have a long road ahead, but I believe we are moving in the right direction. Thank you all for your courage and your willingness to be here. This is how change begins, with listening, with humility, and with hope." The crowd rose to their feet in applause. Edward felt Denise's hand slip into his as they watched the room fill with quiet optimism. Even Monroe and his officers looked lighter, as though the burden of division had begun to ease. As the residents began to leave, Edward stood by the door, shaking hands and sharing kind words. When Taylor approached, Edward extended his hand. "You did well tonight," Edward said sincerely. Taylor shook his hand firmly, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thanks to you, Judge Langston. I would not have gotten here without your example." Edward smiled. "You found your way. Now keep walking it." Taylor nodded and left with Burke, their conversation quiet but filled with promise. As the last of the residents filtered out, Denise turned to her father with a proud smile. "You did it again, Dad." Edward shook his head. "We did it." The stars had begun to dot the night sky as they stepped outside, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. Edward looked up, letting the cool wind brush across his face. "One step at a time," he whispered. And with that, they walked home together, their hearts full, knowing that the ripples of change had grown stronger. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Ashton Pines, painting the quiet streets in soft hues. Edward Langston sat at his kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The night before had been a victory not in the grand, celebratory sense, but in the quiet way that meant something real had shifted. Yet he knew that building trust took more than one meeting. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen as Denise poured herself a cup and took the seat across from him. She gave him a knowing look as she stirred in some cream. "You're thinking again?" she said with a smirk. Edward chuckled and set the paper aside. "Is it that obvious?" "You always get that faraway look after a big moment," Denise replied. "But last night was good, Dad. People listened, even Taylor." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "It was a start, but now comes the hard part, keeping the momentum going." Denise sipped her coffee. "We'll keep going. Michael is already drafting ideas for another workshop, and I heard Burke say he wants to lead a community service project with the youth center." Edward smiled. "That young man has come a long way. It is good to see." There was a soft knock at the door, interrupting their conversation. Denise set her cup down and went to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Officer Taylor standing on the porch, holding a small folder in one hand. His uniform was neat, but his face was uncertain. "Officer Taylor," Denise said, her tone polite but wary. "This is unexpected." Taylor nodded, shifting his weight slightly. "I know. I wanted to see Judge Langston. Is he home?" Denise hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." Taylor walked in, holding his hat at his side as he entered the kitchen. Edward looked up, surprised but calm. "Officer Taylor," he greeted. "What brings you by?" Taylor took a breath, his voice steady but sincere. "I wanted to thank you. Again. And I wanted to show you something." He handed the folder to Edward, who opened it carefully. Inside was a proposal for a new initiative: community walks. The idea was simple: officers would spend time walking the neighborhoods, not on duty but as neighbors, getting to know the residents in a personal, informal way. Edward's eyebrows rose as he scanned the details. This, this is a good idea, Officer Taylor. Taylor's face softened, relief visible in his eyes. I hope so. I realize that if I am going to rebuild trust, I need to do more than show up at meetings. I need to be present in the community, not just when something is wrong. Denise leaned over Edward's shoulder, reading the proposal. This could really work, she said, impressed. Edward closed the folder and nodded. You are right. Trust is built in the small moments, not just the big ones. And this could be a way to start. Taylor's shoulders relaxed. Thank you. I wanted your input before I pitched it to Captain Monroe. Edward stood and extended his hand. You have my full support, and I will speak to Captain Monroe as well. Taylor shook Edward's hand, his grip firm but grateful. That means a lot, sir. Edward smiled warmly. You are earning it, Ryan. Hearing his first name surprised Taylor, but it also reminded him that respect was a two-way street. Over the next few weeks, the Community Walks initiative began to take shape. Flyers went out, inviting residents to meet the officers who patrolled their neighborhoods in an informal, friendly setting. The first walk was scheduled for Saturday morning at the town park. When the day arrived, Edward and Denise made their way to the park to show their support. The air was crisp, and children ran ahead of their parents, their laughter filling the air. Several officers were already there, dressed in casual clothes instead of uniforms. Burke was talking to a group of teenagers about the local basketball league, while Taylor stood near the picnic tables, shaking hands with a few elderly residents. Michael Harrison arrived with his mother, who brought a basket of homemade cookies. Thought I would sweeten the deal, she said with a grin as she handed Edward a bag of cookies. Edward laughed. You are spoiling me, Mrs. Harrison, she winked. Someone has to. Denise watched as the community began to mingle with the officers. This is what we needed, she said quietly. Edward nodded, watching Taylor kneel down to talk to a small boy who was showing off his toy police car. Taylor listened intently, nodding and smiling. The sight filled Edward with cautious pride. Captain Monroe arrived soon after, walking over to greet Edward. Good turnout, Monroe observed, his tone pleased. It is a step in the right direction, Edward replied. Monroe looked around the park, watching his officers interact with the residents. It feels good to see people connecting instead of dividing. He turned back to Edward. You have been a big part of making this happen. Edward shook his head humbly. It took all of us. It always does. As the morning wore on, residents continued arriving, their curiosity turning into genuine connection. Taylor spent time talking with the Harrisons, listening as Michael's mother spoke about her concerns for her son's future. Burke organized a small soccer game with the kids, laughing as they cheered for their favorite teams. By midday, the event began winding down, but the energy lingered. As the last of the residents trickled out, Edward sat on a park bench, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Denise sat beside him, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. Look at them, she said, motioning to the officers and volunteers packing up. They are working together. I did not think I would see this so soon. Edward nodded, a warm smile on his face. People surprise you sometimes. Taylor walked over, wiping his hands on a napkin after helping clean up. Judge Langston, Ms. Langston, he said, standing in front of them. Thank you again for believing in me. Edward looked up at him, his expression serious but kind. Believing in someone is easy, Ryan. It is what they do with that belief that matters. Taylor's face grew resolute. Then I will keep proving it. Edward stood and shook his hand. Good. As Taylor walked back toward the other officers, Denise turned to her father, admiration in her eyes. "You did it again, Dad." Edward chuckled softly. "No, we did it." The breeze stirred the fallen leaves as they walked toward the car, their footsteps light against the gravel path. The day had been filled with small but significant moments, the kind of moments that could build something lasting. Edward felt the quiet hum of hope in the air. It was not just a good day. It was the beginning of something stronger, a bridge built, not with words alone, but with effort, patience, and kindness. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun set over Ashton Pines. The streets were quiet, with the occasional laughter of children playing in their yards before being called in for dinner. Edward Langston sat on his front porch, a soft breeze brushing past as he watched the peaceful scene unfold. The events of the past few weeks played in his mind, the meetings, the conversations, the changes, and he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Peace. Denise stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. She handed one to her father and took the seat beside him. "You've been quiet all day," she said with a curious smile. Edward accepted the mug with a nod. "Just thinking." "Good thoughts?" she asked. Edward sipped his tea, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "Yes, for once, good thoughts." Denise smiled as she leaned back in her chair, her gaze following a pair of cardinals flitting between the trees. "I can't believe how far things have come." Edward nodded, pride filling his voice. "It's a start. The community walks, the workshops, people are coming together. They're talking, listening." "And Officer Taylor?" Denise asked, glancing at her father. Edward chuckled softly. "Ryan Taylor is surprising me. He's been at every community event. Not just showing up, but really listening. He's even volunteered to mentor some of the teens at the youth center." Denise raised her eyebrows. "I never thought I'd hear that sentence a few months ago." Edward smiled. "Me neither, but people can change when they're willing." Denise grew quiet for a moment. "You gave him that chance, Dad. You gave a lot of people that chance." Edward's gaze softened. "People gave me chances too. I wouldn't be here without the kindness of others. It's our job to pass it on." The next morning, the community center was buzzing again, this time for a celebration. The event had been organized to mark the success of the Bridges Not Barriers initiative and to honor the people who had helped make it possible. Tables were set up with food, music played softly in the background, and neighbors greeted each other with laughter and hugs. Michael Harrison stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a broad smile. His mother stood proudly beside him, passing out her famous cornbread muffins. Burke was helping some of the younger kids carry plates of food, while Captain Monroe chatted with a group of elderly residents. Edward arrived with Denise by his side, and a wave of applause rippled through the crowd as they entered. Edward waved humbly, his heart full. Michael made his way over, a grin on his face. "Mr. Langston, Ms. Langston," he greeted. "It wouldn't be a celebration without you." Edward clapped a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You've done good work, Michael. This is your victory as much as anyone's." Michael's smile softened. "It's all of ours." Denise handed Michael a flyer for the next workshop. "And you're leading this one, right?" Michael nodded confidently. "I am. I'm ready." Later in the afternoon, Edward was asked to speak. The room quieted as he stepped to the microphone. He looked out at the familiar faces, the neighbors who had supported each other, the officers who had changed for the better, and the younger generation who would inherit the world they were building. "Good afternoon, everyone," Edward began, his voice steady. "Today is not about any one person. It's about all of us. It's about what happens when we refuse to let fear, prejudice, or assumptions define who we are." The crowd listened intently as he continued. "We've faced hard truths, and we've taken difficult steps, but we've done it together with courage, honesty, and grace." He paused, glancing at Michael and Taylor, who stood near the front. "We've proven that trust can be rebuilt, and that hope, once sparked, can grow. There was a quiet hum of agreement as Edward smiled and said, "This is just the beginning. The work is far from over, but today we celebrate how far we've come and how far we're willing to go." Applause erupted, loud and sustained. Edward stepped back, feeling Denise's hand slip into his as the room filled with warmth. As the event wound down and the last of the decorations were packed away, Edward took a quiet walk around the center. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him and turned to see Officer Taylor approaching. "Judge Langston," Taylor greeted, his face thoughtful but calm. Edward smiled. "Ryan, enjoy the celebration?" Taylor nodded. "I did, but I wanted to ask you something." Edward gestured for him to walk beside him. "Go ahead." Taylor took a breath. "How did you hold on to hope for so long, after everything you've been through?" Edward's eyes softened. "Because I believed that kindness, when met with humility, can create change. And because I saw people like you, people willing to look inward, to grow, to do better." Taylor nodded, absorbing the words. "I'm going to keep trying, every day." Edward clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all anyone can do." They stood in companionable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. That evening, Edward returned home to the familiar comfort of his porch. Denise and Michael stopped by, carrying a basket of leftover food from the celebration. "One last toast?" Denise asked, raising a glass of lemonade. Edward smiled and lifted his glass. "To resilience, to kindness, and to the bridges we've built." They clinked their glasses together, laughter spilling into the quiet night. As the stars began to dot the sky, Edward sat back, listening to the soft hum of life around him. He knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The ripples they had created were spreading, touching lives in ways they might never see. And Edward knew that as long as there were people willing to listen, to learn, and to lead with kindness, hope would endure. Edward Langston's story reminds us that the journey toward justice, trust, and unity begins with small steps, listening, learning, and leading with kindness. While the road may be long and the challenges many, the bridges we build with compassion and resilience can transform not only our communities, but also our hearts. If this story inspired you, consider how you can make a difference in your own life and community. Together, we can create a world where fairness and hope thrive. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss more powerful and meaningful stories like this one. We post new stories regularly, stories of resilience, courage, and change that remind us of the strength we all carry. We'll see you next time.